Beginning tonight on the ABC is a two-part documentary called Big Deal, and also available on ABC iView. And it's my great pleasure to be speaking to the director of Big Deal, Craig Reucassel. Craig, welcome to Movie Metropolis.
Good to be here, Peter.
Now, we don't do many political documentaries in Australia, which is much to my chagrin. So tell me about your involvement with this and how it all started with Christian Van Vuren.
Yeah, well, Christian Van Vuren, who's of course from the Bondi hipsters and done a lot of other work in the industry, was looking at this issue with Jungle. And I was very lucky to have, I had a week off, which was very rare at the time. And I went away and kind of helped just kind of brainstorming. And at the end of that week, they perhaps foolishly suggested that I direct the film, to which I replied, of course, I don't really direct. But they talked me into it, and it was a great process. I mean, I was really thrilled to work with Christian, who I've always loved his work. And it was just a great team of people. Jen Peetham, of course, great documentary maker. As so many good people working on it. So I worked with the editor, Philippa Rowland, who did Revelation and that. So, it was just so many good people to work with.
So tell me about the process of Christian who wrote it, I gather, but you would have had input into it as well, in terms of what was included in the documentary.
Yeah, I mean, it was a really, it kind of changed a lot as we went. I mean, Christian and I, a lot of back and forth about that. It's like seeing it from his perspective, which is he's not a political tragic. So, there are some things that perhaps shocked him more than it might others. But that's kind of the key point of the movie, which is that the things you're allowed to do legally in this system are not what most people would expect are legal. This is not a documentary about what's illegal. The outrage of it is, oh, hang on, this is within the rules. So yeah, it was a lot of back and forth between Christian and I. It was great to work with him.
Well, the whole notion of money in politics, donations, and what gets shoved under the carpet by the political parties and so on is quite a revelation in many respects, and mirrors to some extent what happens in the US, which does it on a huge scale. So tell me more about that process and getting the interviews that you were able to get.
Yeah, well, it is the case that, look, there are some elements where America's worse than us, and we've got some better democratic institutions here, like compulsory voting, and, independent electoral commission, that kind of thing. But on this front, on the money front, we've got a lot of similar rules in the sense that we've got no caps on how big the donations can be, which is not the case in all countries, or caps on how much people can spend. So it creates this arms race where you've got to get as much money as possible. And it was interesting because talking about who we got, I mean, the arms race thing came up in both the interview with Sam Dastyari and with Malcolm Turnbull on both sides. It's like they're both aware of that kind of arms race problem there. But it was great. We got some great people to talk about this. And, you just see it from a lot of different perspectives. You kind of, when Sam Dastyari lays out, you do this to do that, this is why you do it, it all makes sense from the politician's perspective, but it doesn't really make sense from, I think, the democratic perspective. You see why they do it because that's what the rules suggest. But when you see the other side and you talk to like Jeff McCloy, a property developer from Newcastle, and he's talking about giving, paying $100,000 for a lunch with a premier and ministers, and you just go, it's just the normality to him of that situation that kind of blows you away.
Well, this whole notion of lobbying, of getting political favours, if you hand over the dosh, so to speak, I don't think enough people understand that, and what Big Deal does is reveal a lot of that.
Yeah, and that's what we're going to look at, and whether this is whether it's at an acceptable level now. I think that there's always going to be, look, if you're the CEO of Westpac, right, you're going to get a meeting with the treasurer, obviously, because, of the nature and the size of your business, right? It's always going to be there. But is that conversation going to be a balanced one if, you've donated $110,000 to be part of the business forum and you're kind of going, you can say, well, will we take that back? Or on the other hand, you really want to, yes, you want politicians talking to everyone, but you don't want them preferencing the opinions of some because they give them large amounts of cash. And I think that's the problem at the basis of this. It goes against the fundamental basis of democracy, which is one person, one vote. We're meant to be equal in our say.
Meant to be, yes, exactly right. And
Exactly.
and how interesting how no one really from the Labor and Liberal parties, apart from perhaps Malcolm Turnbull, but neither of them were really willing to speak.
No. We actually do speak to. We speak to a couple of. We speak to some Liberal and Labor people, and we actually would have spoken to more, but COVID hit. Interestingly, we'd lined up to speak to a lot of politicians from the Greens, Labor, Liberal, National, and then we went to go down to Canberra, and they shut down Parliament. We couldn't get in there, and it actually worked in our favour a bit because we then did a bit of the edit, and by the time we did that, we kind of realized this is not going to be a movie where we just sit and talk to politicians all the time. That's not what we want. So it became much more about the story from Christian's eyes and talking to people outside of the political sphere as well and seeing how that affected them, farmers in Queensland or whoever it is. And I think it's, to be honest, to the benefit of the movie. So one of the rare good things to come from the COVID lockdowns was not quite as many politicians, but it wasn't necessarily a case of politicians saying, no, I won't talk to you. But it is certainly a case of politicians they like to tell you that it's all fine. This is just the system. It's all fine.
It sure is. Now, with your comedy background and Christian also, I can understand you having a juggling act in terms of how much you want to dramatically expose, how much comedy you want to have in there, whether you go satiric. So I suppose that was an interesting juggle.
Yeah, it was, and it's interesting because if you ever get to see the DVD, you'll see some extras on there that are probably a bit more in the comedic element of things. We got some very cheap goon, cheap wine in a bladder, and filled up empty bottles of wine bottles and put fake Grange labels on them to distribute to politicians and lobbyists and that. And, there are things like that. But it was interesting in the editing process that some of those things fell on to the side just because they didn't kind of fit the narrative or they didn't fit the tone at times. And it's something I think I'd learned from doing documentaries like War and Waste is that, yeah, sure, you can put comedy in at certain times, but there's times where it really gets in the way of the story. And one of the things I said to Christian when we started this is, you are going to have to give a bit of yourself. Comedians tend to distract their emotions with humor, but you actually have to be honest about how you're feeling in this situation. And that's something I learned very much from the people that directed me in War and Waste, and I wanted to bring it, transfer it to Christian in this.
Okay. I suppose one of my expectations was that you'd go down the Michael Moore path and really go full slaughter on the satire.
Well, it's interesting that because we do have stunts in there. We've got Christian, going to the Liberal and Labor Party places with giant checks and that kind of stuff. So there's a little bit of that there. And we tried to go to some of the kind of fundraiser parties that you get. But again, it was interesting. COVID was the one time to not do this because a lot of them were called off. And the ones that weren't called off, and we got very close to one or two of them, but they still went ahead. But they were so cautious about not letting anyone know where they were. So there would have been a little bit more of that, but unfortunately that was a little bit less under COVID.
Okay. The other thing I had in the back of my mind, because our defamation laws are pretty stringent in Australia, whether there were any concerns you had about what you were filming or whether there were any potential issues that cropped up.
Oh, look, there are always concerns with that kind of thing. You work a tightrope in Australia with strict defamation laws. I don't think there was any massive problems in terms of this one, but there were definitely, you have to be cautious on this stuff all the time. So yeah, it didn't stop any major ideas we want to carry out, but you always have to be cognizant of that. And I think we've seen with, Christian Porter's in the ABC recently that, this has become the weaponization of defamation law is probably almost a documentary in itself.
Yes, I can see another documentary looming on that one by itself.
That might be hard to make as enjoyable as this one.
That's a good point. Yes, I can just see ICAC wanting to have a look at that one. But in terms of the way that you then move to some positivity and having the grassroots community involvement and so on, that was a very interesting process. Did that come about organically, or did that was always that in the back of your mind?
No, it did actually come about quite organically. I think that, and it actually came about in the same order that it does in the show. So we kind of went deep into the kind of politics and talking to Dastiari and Turnbull, all that kind of stuff, and the kind of depressing side of it. And one of the things that I found through that is you kind of get to a position where you go, okay, is it the case that these laws will only change if the politicians, who are the people that they kind of benefit from in a way, is it entirely up to them to change them? And one of the things that I think I learned through the war on waste was it had slightly changed my perception of how change occurs and how power exists in the country. I kind of come into it, you talk to the politician, they change the laws, it's, the rest of us watch on. What we actually saw in War on Waste is that the community became really active and responded the fastest. Business actually responded a lot quicker than government. Government was really slow to respond. But once they saw a kind of movement occurring amongst people and others in business, they wanted to get on board. And I had politicians say to me, look, we don't lead, we follow. And so I think we were kind of just cognizant of that when we were looking at this and going, well, is this just an issue where you go, okay, I hit up the politician on the Facebook page, tell them to change the laws. If they don't do it, it's all over. And we looked at it and saw, in actual fact, there's some really interesting kind of grassroots movements around Australia that are changing the nature of politics, or that have had success against quite large money, lobby kind of groups. And that made you go, okay, there is a balance here. I mean, I don't think it's the case that Australia is so unbalanced that your vote doesn't matter at all. We're not at that kind of level yet. It does matter. So yeah, just looking at how the community itself can increase the volume of its voice, while also saying, hey, we might need to quieten down the voice on the other side here of, donors, whether it be business union or otherwise.
Interesting. Very interesting to hear that. I can see now how it's on the ABC, of course, tonight and next week, and on ABC iView, that the documentary will have an educative function. I wonder how much influence it might have, because documentaries can have a lot of influence, especially on maybe parliamentarians.
Well, it's interesting because in a sense, I think that the people least shocked by this are going to be parliamentarians. Parliamentarians, when you talk to them, are like, yeah, what? I don't understand. What's the point of this documentary? Yeah, that's just it. That's how it is. We're within the rules. That's what the rules say. We're within the rules. And I think the more important part of this is kind of seeing what the public response to it is, because I think the question really is there a mismatch between what the public would consider to be, for want of a better word, corrupt action or inappropriate action, and what the rules actually allow? As it stands now, this is not corruption because the rules say otherwise. But is that in line with community expectations, I guess, is the question.
It's a very good question, and I can see how your documentary will serve a discussion point to get more people talking about this, because it is a really important issue. Has this documentary given you and or Christian a sense that maybe it's time to do more documentaries on Australian politics?
Look, I'm not sure about Christian. I think he's desperate to get back to the narrative world, and he's a way better director than I am. He directed Sunshine, the Christmas movie in Adelaide, actually, that was on Stan last year. It was fantastic.
Oh, yeah.
But I am definitely loving the documentary space, and I'm sure we'll see a bit more at some point.
And can we see a revival of The Chaser?
Well, we'll see about that. We're kind of all over the place a little bit at the moment, but it's interesting. Like, Charles has kind of revived the online kind of newspaper part of the Chaser, and that's also doing the Chaser podcast, which is kind of, I'm actually about to do an episode of that right after this, actually. So, it is bringing us back together in that way, and who knows, if we can line up our ducks, maybe we can see something happen at the next election or something. But, the only problem with elections is they never tell you when they are. It's very hard to organise for something that you never know when it is.
That's a very good point. They keep it up their sleeve. So, yeah. Craig, for you, has that now given you a wider brief in terms of directing, or can you see yourself moving into other sort of roles?
Yeah, look, I really enjoyed it, actually. It was great. I mean, there were parts of the directing process that were probably less foreign to me, like the writing, the sitting in an edit and all that kind of stuff has been something we've done always with the Chase. We just haven't had terms directors or whatever. The kind of standing behind the camera rather than in front of it, and kind of that element was a bit new, and I really enjoyed it. It also gave me an insight, Peter, into why sometimes I'm frustrating to the directors on the other side. So hopefully I'll be better next time. Like you kind of like, Jodie Boylan, who directs me on, Five Planet A and that, she'll like, Craig, do this. And then when I'm on the other side of the camera looking, I go, oh, now I know where Jodie says that. So I learned a lot, both for behind the camera and in front of it.
Okay. And just about, you mentioned editing, and you've mentioned that a few times. The editing process is also where documentaries are really constructed or reconstructed, so to speak. Was that much of an issue in terms of what you kept in and what you left out?
It wasn't an issue, but it was a long and difficult process. And luckily I had Philippa Rowlands by my side, who was that experienced, because it was a difficult one. There's so much in this topic area, and you kind of want to make sure you're being as accurate as possible, but you just can't cover every aspect of it. So it was a long process, but a really enjoyable one too. And kind of getting that mixture of, Christian and his energy on the screen, and a narrative kind of journey there was a real challenge. But I think we kind of got there in the end. I'll leave that to others to judge.
Well, congratulations on it. I found it really interesting to watch, and quite a revelation in many respects. So well done on that. And just the last question I love asking all filmmakers. Craig, have you seen any other documentaries, films, streaming, anything that lately that has impressed you?
Oh, that's always the hardest question for me. I'm terrible at watching stuff. What did I watch recently? You know what I did watch recently? And you can't tell Jen this, but I watched Sherpa again, and my God, it's so good. I watched it on one of the streaming services the other day, and it is just so brilliant. And the scale of it's amazing. So yeah, that's very good. But it was very good to work with her. I'll say that.
Yes, no, Jen's films, and in fact, she has a new one about to come out, hasn't she? River. Yeah.
Yes. I'm desperate to see it. I'm hoping there's actually going to be it's kind of the kind of thing you have to see in a big screen. And obviously we haven't had big screens. I mean, this was released as a movie, but unfortunately there were pretty much no screens. So, now that we're actually having cinemas open around the country, hopefully we'll be able to see River on the big screen.
Absolutely. And just very quickly, the one question I omitted to ask you, the title, Big Deal, can have a number of meanings. What made you decide to settle on that?
Peter, you're absolutely spot on. And the hardest part of anything is always coming up with the title. And I've got to say, we came up with it right at the last minute. It was Christian's suggestion. But it does have a lot of meanings, because it's kind of like, yes, this is a big deal, but it also reflects the fact that Christian's journey is kind of from going from the average kind of Aussie thing of like, big deal. That's just how it is, big deal. And then learning, hang on a second. No, it actually is a big deal, and I can be a part of it as well. So yeah, there's a lot of meanings to it. And I'm glad you picked up on that, Peter. Well done.
Big Deal is now screening on the ABC and ABC iView, and we've been speaking to Craig Reucassel, the director of Big Deal. Thanks, Craig, so much for talking with me.
Thanks, Peter. Cheers.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Good on you. Thanks for that. Good chat.